Hi folks, my name's Derek. I'm a developer advocate at AWS and welcome to my session on how to build beautiful production-ready apps with AWS Amplify. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to show you how you can build full-stack applications that not only showcase a UI designer's ideas on how apps will look, but also how you can deploy these apps across multiple AWS accounts and regions. And I'm going to show you all this using a concrete example of an app that I built. So let's dive in. Let's make no mistake, building applications is hard. And it's not helped by the fact that typically we have many personas, each helping to build different parts or features of the application, with each of these personas using their own preferred toolsets and techniques. For example, you may have the UX designer to make the look and feel of the application and the usability delight its users. Or you'll have the developer who uses the components generated by the designer and wires them all together into a data model. Developers would usually do this by writing lots and lots of code. And then finally, you have the DevOps engineer, or SRE, who takes the app and monitors and maintains that code and also builds an automated build and deployment pipeline as part of an automate everything strategy. Each of these personas produce different assets that slow the process of building the application down, as time is wasted translating each persona's asset into terms the other persona can understand. But what if I told you that you could satisfy all of these personas' needs while still allowing each to keep using their associated tools and libraries across the entire application lifecycle? Well, today I'm going to tell you how you can also do this, and I'll also show you how to do it using Amplify and the AWS Cloud Development Kit. If you haven't come across AWS Amplify before, it's simply a set of tools and abstractions that bring the power of AWS to developers who may not be familiar with the intricate detail of what AWS services can do. These might be front-end developers or developers who are new to the AWS platform. With the Amplify CLI and Amplify Studio, you can provision and configure AWS backends for your applications, then connect those backends into your client applications using the open source Amplify client libraries. You can then implement some of the available Amplify feature categories inside your app to easily add the functionality that you want the app to do for your users. For example, with Amplify, you can easily add data storage, authentication, and file storage. You can host your app and set up a CI/CD pipeline. And you can even add more advanced capabilities like AI/ML or geolocation and mapping to your application too. AWS Amplify supports iOS, Android, Flutter for mobile applications, and all the popular front-end frameworks that you may use, like React or Vue or Angular. And you can use all of these tools in an existing app, or you can use them together in a new one. We also see a nice correlation between Amplify's capabilities and the typical steps that go into building a typical application. Steps like these. First you build it, then you ship it, and finally you need to scale to meet demand. In the building phase, you add the fundamental building blocks like storage and data and authentication inside your application and then connect those things to your front end. The front end can be web or mobile and written in your favorite framework using your favorite tooling. Next, you need to release your application out into the world. Customers have to use that application, so you need to ship it fast. And then the final stage is all around scaling that application. So this is where we typically add those post-MVP features, like AI and ML or geolocation as examples. You're also going to make sure that your application can handle any influx of users so that it keeps scaling when more customers come on board. And you also want to have full control of extending your code base. And each of these stages usually include one or more of the personas that we have identified earlier. So first of all, let's look at the personas involved in the build and ship phases of an application's development lifecycle. I think most of us would have an idea of what the developer persona does, but what about the UX designer persona, and more importantly, the relationships between the two? Let's do that by walking through what a typical workflow looks like for these personas. You typically start off with an idea, or you have a feature that you want to build into your application. A UX designer would work on building the designs for the product or feature. And these designs might be built with tools such as Figma, Sketch, or Adobe XD. And then finally, these UI designs somehow need to make their way over to the developer. The standard artifact that designers hand off to developers is usually called a wireframe. And then it's up to the developer to take that wireframe, rationalize it into a set of components. Also have to lay these components out, bind them to the underlying data model, and also write custom logic and determine how the components all fit and work together. And the back and forth that happens as a result just slows that application delivery down. And then, of course, there's always some loss of communication. So what ends up happening inevitably is that design decisions made by a designer tend to get lost in the wash. So how do we solve this? Well, we see two options that usually happen. Either we see a solution that enables designers to take control from end to end of the application, or more commonly, we see the solution that enables developers, and developers then take control and go end to end. But surprise, surprise, neither really work. Because fundamentally they're different skill sets, and there's a reason why we have designers and developers working together to build products. Designers have a specific skill set, and developers have a specific skill set. So what we really need is a solution to help facilitate the designer-developer handoff, ensuring that developers can incorporate close to pixel-perfect UI designs. So this is where Amplify Studio and Figma can help build visually complete, feature-rich apps faster, maintaining full control over the application code. If you haven't used Figma before, it's a free collaborative interface design tool that is entirely browser-based, unlike traditional design applications like Sketch or Photoshop, where you would typically share your work using an image file. In Figma, you simply share a URL link to the Figma file for colleagues to open in their own browser, therefore saving significant time and inconvenience in a designer's workflow. That workflow would typically look like this. A designer would start in Figma and create the initial designs and look and feel of the application or feature being built. These designs and components are then synced from Figma into Amplify Studio, which then will automatically generate React code for the developer to use. Amplify Studio then accelerates the process by handling all the complexities required to set up UI components, a backend, and connect the two together. But don't take my word for it. Let's see all this in action by building our own application. So today, I'm going to build an app that I will call Rate My Drink. I will use the app to rate the drinks that I have time to consume. I've started to use Amplify to create the application scaffold and an idea of what this app will do. I will then take that scaffold and add the UI components that will be designed in Figma by the UX designer. I will finally import these designs into my app as React code to make it look exactly like the designer intended. So let's dive in. So here is the Rate My Drinks app. To use it, you simply put in the drink's name and then give it a rating in stars between 1 and 5. Once you're happy, hit the Add button and it should then appear in a list in the bottom. It's very simple, but it shows you the functionality that I need to create. That is the ability to add a drink rating and the ability to display the drinks I have rated. Finally, we also want to add a picture to the drink into the application so I can see what I've drunk as well. Let's have a look at the code. I'm using a simple React app. The majority of the code is in app.js, and it's where I can control the drinks I've added. I'm using Amplify Data Store feature category, which build an API and a persistence data store in the AWS Cloud backend for me. It even controls syncing state between client and backend. The UI of the app is a number of components: navbar, add item card, and table card. If you go into the command line and using the Amplify CLI, I call Amplify Status. This shows me that indeed Data Store has created an API and there are details about that API. Next, I can type in Amplify Console and open up Amplify Studio, where I can see my application's backend through a single pane of glass. I can view existing content that I have, so the drinks that I've already created, but I can also add a new drink. I could give it a name and a rating, as those fields are red and as such are mandatory. So let's verify this by looking at the data model, which I can also do here. As you can see, name and rating are mandatory, image and price are not. So that's my app. Next, I'm going to start design and thinking about the UX designs. My designer uses Figma. So let's connect Amplify Studio to Figma, which I'll do now. Once in Figma, I can select my own template or a pre-made template. I'm going to use an existing Amplify template. This template has a whole bunch of primitives that I can't edit and components that I can edit. So let's start editing one of those provided components in Figma. I'm going to choose card G, and I'll go and change this like a UX designer would, adjusting things like default colors for the rating stars, formatting the label text, or finally removing all the fields that I just don't want, making the component clear and suitable for my application. Once I'm happy with that, I import the component into Amplify Studio, which I do simply by using the URL from Figma. Once it's imported, I can then select card G in Amplify Studio and start to configure it for my application. The first thing it needs is the mapping from my data model fields into the various properties of the component. So that's what I'm doing now, working my way through the properties and assigning them to the data model fields in my data model. Once I've done them all, I can actually test them and how they would look by using the auto content generation feature in Amplify Studio. I can generate random content and provide constraints on the generated data, like having a rating between 1 and 5. Once I've generated this data, I can then go back into my component and see how all those fields will look, if the mapping is correct, and so on by shuffling through generated data. Finally, I can see what a collection of these components will look like. I can create a collection and change how it will be displayed. In this collection, I can change things like spacing between elements, the order of the elements, and other such details. Once I'm happy with all of this, I can then import the component into my React app. And Amplify Studio helps me with this too, by gives me the exact instructions on how I go about this. So once I do an Amplify pull, I generate JavaScript code for all the components that's been done for me in Amplify Studio. Once it's completed, I can then use these components inside my app. So let's use drink collection by removing all of the redundant code I wrote earlier to display the table of drinks and replace it all with the newly styled drink component. Notice here that I'm wrapping all the Amplify generated components in an Amplify provider component. And then adding my drink collection component. Now let's see how my application looks. Just like the UX designer envisaged. I have much better looking than my original, that's for sure. Finally, I can also change some properties in the application code itself. So let's add some pagination and change the page length to 2. Save that, redeploy, and there you go. My application looks a lot nicer thanks to the UX designer and developer working together in Figma and Amplify Studio. So let's quickly recap on what has happened. The developer, me, started to scaffold out the Rate My Drink application. They needed the UI designer's input and help to make the app usable and accessible to its users. You know, make it pretty. Designers then edited the components inside their tool of choice, which in this case was Figma. These designs were then exported into Amplify Studio. Designer and/or developer could then use these design components inside the React application, as the component code was all generated for me. And so once we have built the beautiful product, it's time to hand it over to a new collaboration of personas. We need the SRE persona and the developer persona to start working together to improve our application by giving the users the features it needs. but also to build automation in the build and deployment pipeline, so the users get their features as quickly as possible. But what about in our app's case where we are using Amplify, and its users want the functionality that Amplify doesn't offer? Or the deployment pipeline we need has already been standardized by another team. How are we going to satisfy the ship and scale related personas demands, but still harness the benefits of AWS Amplify? Well, the good news is we can do this even with projects that use AWS Amplify. Thanks to a few new features that have been added in the last year, we can now extend apps beyond their core Amplify use cases, leveraging the full breadth and depth of AWS services, including adding support for internal DevOps practices and tooling. And so you can do this by leveraging the power of the AWS Cloud Development Kit, or CDK. This is a natural fit, as like Amplify, it's an open source and has common community backing. Amplify's purpose is to accelerate full-stack application development on AWS. The CDK's purpose, on the other hand, is to accelerate the adoption of infrastructure as code practices on AWS. By enabling the creation of infrastructure as code templates in your own favorite programming languages, so it supports JavaScript, C#, and Go, to name but a few. So let's see how this would work in practice. All of these new extension commands are driven from the Amplify CLI. The first use case it covers if you want to modify existing features Amplify has created. If, for example, you have this use case where you want to change one of the properties of a service, this property may not be exposed by Amplify. Because remember, with Amplify, the value proposition is about abstracting complexity away from the developers. However, with the Amplify override command, you can override the default behavior of the Amplify service and the service that Amplify is provisioning to suit the needs of the application. Simply run Amplify override and then a desired category to modify every infrastructure level setting for Amplify generated resources using the AWS CDK. What about if you don't want to change an Amplify feature, but rather add an additional feature to your backend application that Amplify doesn't support? So much like the use case described here. Well, you can do that with Amplify add command, which enables developers to add custom resources from over 200 AWS services to your Amplify app using the AWS CDK. Some of you may be aware that you can currently do this by modifying the CloudFormation templates that Amplify generates. However, this is a long and cumbersome process of 4 or more steps. Now, by simply running Amplify add custom, you will enable to add these services to your Amplify app. And then finally, what if you want to use the Amplify generated application and backend, but want to deploy it using a centralized deployment pipeline that may already exist with its own DevOps guidelines and principles, where Amplify is just a very small part of a much bigger whole? Well, you can do that too by running Amplify export to export your Amplify backend as a CDK app to deploy with your own pipeline. Your existing pipeline can then import the Amplify app and deploy it across accounts or regions, depending on your existing deployment strategies. So let's see how that would work for my application. Let's say that the Rate My Drinks app needs to be deployed using an AWS code pipeline setup across multiple accounts and or regions. So here we are in a CDK project that defines a typical build and deployment pipeline. If we look at the entry point, we can see all the config values have been externalized in config.json. The constructors are typical for a CDK stack, and this particular CDK project has been written in TypeScript. If we look inside config.json itself, we can see how we can specify different properties like the pipeline name, what code repo it's based on, etc., etc. We can also pass one or many environments into the pipeline. Each of these can be across accounts and or regions. Next, if we drill into the pipeline stack itself, we can see a few things. First of all, we can see the pipeline is kicked off from a GitHub code repo. We connect to the repo using a shared public access token, which we store in AWS Secrets Manager. Second, we can see we have a number of stages that this pipeline deploys to. Notice how different accounts and regions are passed into these stages. If we then look at the stages themselves, we can see that they use the CDK Amplify stack. which defines what is deployed. So let's have a look at what this is. We see that there are a couple of AWS services being deployed here, an SMS topic with a subscription, and a Lambda function that publishes on the topic when invoked. If you now switch to the code pipeline console, we can see what is actually being provisioned by this CDK pipelines project. We can see the source code repo and the update pipeline step. The update pipeline step is unique to CDK pipelines, as you can update them from CDK code that's in your repository. In this case, we have two deployment stages. We could also have gates and tests between stages if we wanted them to. Now let's switch back to our Rate My Drink app and bring the resources and services it needs provisioning into our pipeline. First, let's see what resources we have. Amplify status tells us that we have an API feature category and that it's currently being provisioned as the backend for the application. Next, we need to export this using Amplify Export. What Amplify Export does is create a new CDK stack from our Amplify project that can then be imported into another CDK stack. In our case, this will be our pipeline stack. We can also get instructions on how to import this into our CDK project. And if we look at the exported files, or files that have been created, we can see all of the details of our API backend. In this case, it's GraphQL with AWS AppSync and storage using Amazon DynamoDB. Once that's complete, we simply switch back to the CDK pipeline stack. Remembering to copy the instructions first, and import the required CDK dependencies so we can import our Amplify export. Next, we go into the deployment stack and add that dependency. And then we use it to import the Amplify backend configuration. We just need to supply the location of the files and the stages that we want to apply it to. And that's it. Our Amplify project is now part of our code pipeline deployments. So we've taken the fledgling Rate My Drink app a long way. Let's recap what has happened. A UX designer persona has created the UI components for the app in Figma, their tool of choice. These designs have been imported into Amplify Studio and connected with the app's data model. The application itself is using Amplify Data Store feature category to easily create a backend database and API layer. We can then add other new feature categories from Amplify and ones that Amplify doesn't support into our application, before finally using the Amplify CLI to export the application for use in code pipeline deployments. Now our app's deployed, we want to see and hope that our users like it. So what's happening here? Well, what we now see is more and more traditional front-end developers becoming increasingly aware of the facets of the application lifecycle and the personas that build them. However, they are still more productive as they can keep using the skills and tools they know and love, but can choose to apply them across the full development stack. And what AWS does with tools like Amplify and AWS CDK is provide a seamless experience that meet developers where they are, enabling them to innovate faster and with confidence, but still being able to satisfy guardrails often required when building and supporting critical high-skill workloads. And that is the aim of not only the tools that we've discussed today, but other tools shown here that enable developers to accelerate their application development, increase developer productivity, and innovate faster. So as developers, we can use what we need and still be productive, from a full stack front to back solution to just a front end hosting or UI components that integrate with our AWS provisioned resources. If you want to learn more about what I have went through today, docs.amplify.aws is a great place to start. Or if you want to start building using Amplify Studio, like I showed in this demo, you can go to sandbox.amplify.app.com and get started without needing access to sign up for an AWS account. If you want to learn more, we encourage you to get engaged with our training and certification content today. Scan one or both of the QR codes on the screen to get started with your cloud skills training and certification. Thanks for listening and making it to the end. My name is Derek. I'm a developer advocate at AWS. My Twitter handle is here. Feel free to reach out and connect. If you want to send feedback on this talk, please do so. Until then, I'll see you next time. Bye.